When he wandered through a store, he could almost sense Kramer whispering opinions over his shoulder, commenting on shirts, laughing at odd patterns, making the simplest errand feel like a shared moment. Yet the same character who once brought millions joy would later drag Michael Richards into a collapse that unfolded in barely 2 minutes. What Richards assumed was just another uneasy night at the Laugh Factory spiraled into catastrophe the instant a heckler shouted at the wrong time. His response was immediate, explosive, and filled with words that could never be reclaimed. In the grainy footage, he can be seen gripping the stage lights, shaking with fury. His face flushed, his voice tearing under the weight of his rage. By the end of the night, club owner Jamie Masada issued a lifetime ban. Not even Jerry Seinfeld's public support could pull him out of the storm. And when Richards attempted an apology on David Letterman's show, the moment only deepened the wound. The video of that night has become its own grim archive, an unbroken record of a man unraveling in front of an audience. Michael Anthony Richards was born on July 24, 1949, in Culver City, and from the very start, life seemed to place a heavy hand on him. His mother, Phyllis Nardazzi, worked as a medical records librarian and tried to give her son a quiet upbringing. But she was living with a truth she could not bring herself to say aloud. She told Michael his father was William Richards, an electrical engineer who died in an accident when Michael was a toddler. She repeated the story until it hardened into family lore. But none of it was real. The reality was far more painful. Michael had been conceived after Phyllis was assaulted in 1948. She was young, isolated, and terrified. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, and she was desperate to protect herself and her child. So she invented a father, created the surname Richards, and built an entire narrative to shield them both. Michael would later describe the secret as a shadow that followed him everywhere, a quiet reminder that he did not come into the world by choice, and that even success could never quite silence a lingering feeling of displacement. The truth found him decades later. In the late 1980s, he began searching into his family history and hired a private investigator to locate the man named on his birth certificate. He expected answers. Instead, he discovered that the person he thought was his father never existed. When he confronted his mother, she finally broke. She confessed everything. Richards would say the revelation felt as if the ground beneath him cracked open. He had to face the fact that he was born from violence, that his mother had once considered placing him for adoption, that she had invented an entire identity out of fear. He spoke openly about how that moment split something inside him, feeding a lifetime of anger, self-doubt, and the constant search for belonging. Growing up did little to ease that turbulence. He spent his early years in South Los Angeles, raised by his mother and a grandmother who battled paranoid schizophrenia. For his first 6 years, his grandmother was his primary caregiver, but as her illness worsened, she was eventually hospitalized. Their home was a place where stability came and went without warning. Michael grew up bracing for sudden change, learning early that nothing in his world was secure. That unease stayed with him, shaping a mind constantly scanning for emotional ground that would not give way. Yet even in that environment, a spark of possibility remained. In grade school, he discovered the Forensic League, a world of debate, dramatic interpretation, and public speaking. For the first time, he could channel the noise and fear from home into performance. Judges noticed his unusual command of a room, his expressive voice, and the intensity behind his eyes. Winning those events offered him something he had never felt before: control. Applause became a doorway out of anxiety, a way to momentarily rewrite the script of his own life. At home, he disappeared into the world of silent comedy. He devoured the films of Charlie Chaplin, Jacques Tati, and Red Skelton, studying their movements as if they held the answers to something deeper. Chaplin's ability to bury sorrow beneath humor resonated with him. Tati's deliberate, poetic physicality mesmerized him. Skelton's wild, exaggerated routines ignited something instinctive and fierce. Decades later, their influence would explode onto living room screens every time Kramer crashed through Jerry Seinfeld's apartment door. But in those early years, imitation was not about craft, it was survival. It was the only language he had for emotions he could not articulate. He graduated from Thousand Oaks High School in 1967 and threw himself into theater with relentless focus. School productions became a refuge, a place where applause eclipsed the gnawing sense of being unwanted. Each performance offered a momentary wholeness he chased obsessively, a hunger that would follow him through every stage of his life. In 1968, Richards enrolled at Evergreen State College in Olympia, stepping into a theater culture defined by experimentation. The program emphasized improvisation and physical storytelling, an ideal match for his style. His path wound through multiple institutions, including the California Institute of the Arts, and eventually through military service during the Vietnam era. Stationed in West Germany, he co-directed theatrical pieces for soldiers, shows focused on the social turmoil of the time. By 1975, he completed his Bachelor of Arts in Drama, carrying with him years of training on how to use his body as a storytelling instrument. During this period, he teamed up with Ed Begley Jr. for an improvisational act and became widely known on campus as the irrepressibly funny performer who could transform a room with little more than a gesture. It was the first time people outside of school circles began to recognize his unusual talent. He also received an unexpected brush with national attention. On November 11, 1967, he appeared on The Dating Game. He did not win, but his awkward, offbeat humor caught the audience's attention. The show was a major cultural stage at the time, often propelling young entertainers into the public eye. For Richards, the appearance was exhilarating, but also unsettling. Behind the jokes and charm, he still carried the weight of a childhood built on silence and secrets, a tension that would remain part of him for years. While still in college, he pushed himself into stand-up comedy, testing whether his strange blend of characters, voices, and physical extremes could work in live rooms. He performed in dorm lounges and small clubs, building a reputation for wild, unpredictable sets. Friends compared him to Robin Williams and Andy Kaufman, two performers known for their volatility and brilliance. Richards was raw, intense, and magnetic, a performer who existed on the edge of chaos, long before the rest of the world would know his name. Those first nights on stage, performing without a script, gave him an early taste of what it meant to hold an audience purely through presence. It was a skill that would later define some of his most iconic moments on live television. But despite that promise, money was always scarce. Richards took whatever work he could find, delivery routes, short-term jobs, anything to keep himself afloat. After his military service, he depended heavily on the GI Bill to stay in school. The constant financial strain echoed the instability of his childhood, reinforcing that old fear that he had no rightful place in the world. Even so, he pressed forward. He kept performing and kept trying to transform his internal turmoil into something meaningful. In Seattle, he found refuge within avant-garde theater groups that explored subjects like mental illness, themes that paralleled the memories he carried from home. For Richards, these experimental productions became a form of emotional excavation. His performances grew more physical, more expressive, and more exposed. He learned how to channel vulnerability into power, how to make audiences laugh while letting them feel the ache beneath the comedy. Those years shaped the distinct style that would one day become his signature. After graduating from Evergreen in 1975, Richards drove to Los Angeles with nothing but ambition. He had no money, no industry contacts, and no real plan, just a conviction that he needed to try. The early rejections were sharp and personal. Each dismissal seemed to confirm the old narrative that he was not wanted. But he pushed through auditions, minor roles, and long stretches of silence, waiting for something, anything, that might shift his path. In 1979, that shift arrived. Billy Crystal invited him onto a 1-hour HBO special filled with live sketches. Richards dominated the stage with explosive physicality and improvised outbursts. The performance caught the eye of people who had never heard his name before. It suggested that Richards might be more than a struggling comic trying to survive Los Angeles. Industry attention finally began to move toward him. A year later, he was cast on ABC's late-night sketch series Fridays, which ran from 1980 to 1982. The show was frenetic, experimental, and often chaotic, an atmosphere where Richards thrived. He worked alongside Larry David, who would later co-create Seinfeld, and quickly became known for characters that bordered on the unhinged. One moment became infamous. During a live broadcast, Andy Kaufman refused to read his lines. Richards stormed onto the stage with cue cards in hand, igniting a confrontation that people still recount decades later. Fridays taught him how to make split-second decisions, how to commit completely to a character, and how to withstand the pressure of live television. His first film appearance came in 1982 with Young Doctors in Love, a Gary Marshall parody that earned 3 times its budget at the box office. Richards played a clumsy intern, stealing scenes through physical comedy. It did not propel him to stardom, but it kept him moving. He remained typecast, forever the oddball, the eccentric, and kept searching for a role that would let him break beyond that mold. He made guest appearances on Cheers in 1984, playing an offbeat cab driver, and on St. Elsewhere in 1985, where he attempted a more dramatic turn. The parts were brief, but they preserved his visibility. Hollywood continually tried to confine him to one narrow category, but Richards pushed back, determined to show he could do more. The 1980s brought long stretches of rejection and frustration. He endured endless auditions and sometimes turned down small theater roles because he was desperate to secure television work. The pressure grew heavy. His first marriage ended in 1992, and the isolation of Hollywood combined with his old childhood wounds began to erode his confidence. Still, he returned to the one place that felt familiar, the stage. At the Groundlings, he worked through improvisational drills and live sketches. Backward walks, sudden bursts of energy, unpredictable shifts, many of the traits that would one day define Kramer first emerged here. The Groundlings gave him a laboratory to sharpen his instincts, even during years when his professional life felt uneven. He watched others advance and wondered when his moment would finally come. But he kept showing up. He kept practicing. His comedic style grew more refined, more peculiar, and increasingly unforgettable. So when Michael Richards walked into that audition room in 1989, he knew the odds were not in his favor. Yet he also carried something volatile and electric. Larry David initially envisioned the character as a subdued neighbor. Jerry Seinfeld argued for Richards, remembering the untamed brilliance he had shown on Fridays. Richards took in the empty room, paused, and let instinct guide him. He didn't stand at the mark in red lines. Instead, he launched into a handstand, rolled into a cartwheel, and then backed his way out of the room as if the character itself were tugging him away. The entire audition lasted less than 4 minutes, but it stunned everyone watching. The fusion of anarchy and precision made it clear no one else could play Cosmo Kramer. Once cast, Richards built the character from the outside first. The network wanted Kramer polished. Richards refused. He spent days driving around Southern California, digging through thrift stores for mismatched shirts, outdated patterns, old bowling designs, loose trousers, and pants hems that rose oddly high. He acquired more than 60 shirts and jackets, but only 2 pairs of shoes, both Doc Martens, because they allowed him to slide across Jerry's apartment floor like he was floating. He even hand-painted white stars onto the boots, then later covered them in black when the look felt off. He styled his hair upward, letting it stand in place while the sides stayed neat, creating the unmistakable silhouette that would become one of television's most recognizable images. Through every choice, Richards sharpened a character who felt simultaneously chaotic and precise. And for the next decade, that energy transformed Kramer into a phenomenon that few in television history have ever matched. By the later seasons, Kramer's image had become such a cultural force that fans began hunting down his signature vintage shirts in overwhelming numbers. The costume department eventually had to manufacture their own replicas just to keep up. Every detail bore Richards' influence, shaping a character who looked as if he had stepped through a portal from another era. When the Seinfeld pilot first aired on July 5, 1989, Richards wasted no time establishing that odd gravitational pull that defined Kramer. He burst into Jerry's apartment with a sliding, almost acrobatic entrance that would become his trademark. At the time, the character was legally required to be called Kessler, but even with the placeholder name, the essence was unmistakable. He moved as though physics simply bent around him. Early ratings were modest, yet audiences kept talking about the neighbor with the unexplainable entrances, the man who could steal the spotlight with nothing more than the way he walked into a room. His improvisational touches, like the famous Assman moment, proved that he wasn't just interpreting scripts, he was shaping them, elevating small comedic beats into scenes people would revisit for decades. The accolades came quickly. In 1993, Richards earned his first Emmy for his performance in The Junior Mint, an episode cemented in television history thanks to a tiny mint drop during a surgical procedure. The following year, he won again for The Mango. and in 1997, he took home a third Emmy for The Little Kicks, thanks to a wildly uncoordinated dance sequence that went viral long before the internet made that word commonplace. Reruns would replay that dance more than 10 million times. Among the core Seinfeld cast, Richards alone achieved 3 Emmy wins, proof of how his physical performance elevated the entire series. Richards' fame extended beyond Seinfeld as well. Between 1993 and 1997, he crossed over into Mad About You, playing the same character in a shared sitcom universe. One memorable bit involved Kramer inadvertently causing a rickshaw fire. That week, ratings for both shows surged by roughly 15%. The crossover became one of television's earliest and smartest examples of leveraging a fan-favorite character to unite different audiences. And then came Festivus. In 1997, the episode The Strike introduced the aluminum pole and the absurd holiday that fans still celebrate. Nearly 30 million viewers were watching that year, and the traditions, like the airing of grievances, jumped straight out of the script and into American culture. It fit perfectly with Seinfeld's philosophy, elevating the mundane into something iconic. And with every twitch, stumble, and improvised gesture, Kramer gave the show a cinematic energy all its own. But success carried shadows. In 1998, NBC reportedly offered Richards a spin-off deal worth around $1 million per episode. He turned it down. He feared becoming trapped inside the Kramer persona, unable to escape a character he had crafted so meticulously. Still, when The Michael Richards Show debuted in 2000, it lasted barely 2 months. The cancellation confirmed his deepest fear, that escaping Kramer's gravity might be nearly impossible. Financially, Seinfeld had been extraordinary. By 1997, Richards was reportedly making around $600,000 per episode. The final season alone earned him about $13 million. Over the years, estimates placed his total earnings from the show between roughly $40 and $46 million. But despite the success, he admitted that the applause never fully quieted his self-doubt. He lived in a strange intersection of acclaim and emotional unease, an inner conflict that would trail him long after the show ended. Behind the scenes, Richards influenced more than audiences realized. In 1994, during The Bottle Deposit, he pushed for additional physical comedy and improvised the backward bottle routine on the spot. No one had planned it, yet it became the episode's standout moment and ultimately contributed to an Emmy nomination. His creative instincts sometimes clashed with Jerry Seinfeld, who preferred sticking closely to the written page. Yet those disagreements often birthed the biggest laughs. Real pain followed him onto the stage as well. At the Friars Club roast in 1993, Richards injured his knee performing a basketball stunt. He needed surgery and spent months in a brace. Rather than hide it, he incorporated the limp into Kramer's movements. Viewers laughed because the limp felt authentic, unaware that they were watching Richards turn genuine pain into comedy. Away from the cameras, he avoided the celebrity nightlife. At the height of Seinfeld's fame, he spent most evenings alone, painting or writing. The isolation, however, grew heavier with time. He turned down 2 opportunities to host Saturday Night Live because the pressure felt suffocating. Later, he would openly discuss how learning the truth of his conception, being born from assault, left deep emotional scars. The revelation fueled insecurities that made the spotlight feel less like success and more like exposure. He carried that weight quietly as the years went on. Even Kramer's appearance continued to evolve under his guidance. In 1995, Richards suggested giving the character a ponytail. Early reactions were explosive. Test audiences laughed so hard that producers worried it would overwhelm the story. He abandoned the idea, helping instead to refine the mullet that would become one of Kramer's defining looks. It was yet another detail Richards sculpted from the ground up. His film career also continued in parallel. In 1993, he accepted an eccentric supporting role in So I Married an Axe Murderer. The film, featuring Mike Myers and Nancy Travis, opened on July 30, 1993 with a $20 million budget. It debuted in 349 theaters, earning just $3.4 million its first weekend. By the end of its run, it had grossed only about $11.6 million domestically, far below what it needed. Critics were harsh. Many felt Richards appeared strained, as though he were fighting too hard to break away from the shadow of Kramer. Some insisted that the spark audiences loved on Seinfeld simply wasn't present on the big screen. It marked the beginning of rumors about the so-called Seinfeld curse, the idea that the show's cast would never find equivalent success beyond the sitcom. Still, Richards persisted. And when NBC premiered The Michael Richards Show on October 24, 2000, the first episode drew approximately 13 to 19 million viewers, an enormous number for a new comedy at the time. Michael Richards' post-Seinfeld career began with promise, but the momentum did not last. His first major project after the sitcom, The Michael Richards Show, launched strongly but quickly lost viewers. By the 8th episode, only about 6 million people were still watching, and the network canceled the series. Behind the scenes, cast members described creative conflicts, and fans complained that Richards seemed unable to break away from the Kramer persona. One co-star later called the experience a nightmare, blaming Richards' behavior and difficulty adjusting to a new leading role. Critics agreed that the show felt repetitive, as if Richards were trying, and failing, to escape the shadow of his most famous character. He took smaller roles afterward. In 2007, he voiced Bud Ditchwater in B-Movie, which earned $287 million globally on a $150 million budget. But the marketing relied heavily on Jerry Seinfeld and Renee Zellweger, and Richards' contribution barely registered. Hollywood studios treated him cautiously, believing his recent live-action failures made him a risk. Even after B-Movie achieved cult status, it did nothing to revitalize his career. He had already struggled in earlier attempts to reinvent himself. In 1997, he co-starred with Jeff Daniels in Trial and Error, a courtroom comedy that grossed just $13.6 million domestically against a $25 million budget. Critics said he leaned too heavily on physical comedy reminiscent of Kramer, offering nothing new. With a 51% Rotten Tomatoes score, it became another reminder of an actor stuck in familiar patterns. In 2001, Richards surprised many by declining a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He said he did not feel worthy. He spoke openly about lifelong insecurity, rooted partly in learning that his mother had once considered aborting him. That memory lingered. Fame felt unstable, even hollow. He also turned down opportunities to host Saturday Night Live, twice, because he feared he was not good enough. After Seinfeld ended in 1998, he returned to stand-up in hopes of establishing a new identity. But audiences taunted him with requests to do the Kramer slide. What sounded playful to crowds cut deeply into his biggest fear, that he was nothing more than one character. Richards later said these moments triggered the same insecurities he had carried since childhood. His personal life had its own turbulence. His marriage to Kathleen Lyons ended in 1993, and friends said he struggled emotionally for years afterward. He later built a quiet partnership with Beth Skip, who gave birth to their son in 2010, though Richards often isolated himself and went long stretches without close contact. Therapy became part of his routine in the 2000s as he confronted anger rooted in childhood trauma. His grandmother had schizophrenia, and an assault he suffered as a young man left lasting damage. Despite years of therapy, he said the anger never fully went away, it simmered beneath the surface. All of this set the stage for his public collapse on November 17, 2006. That night at the Laugh Factory in Los Angeles, Richards arrived late and walked into a restless, intoxicated crowd. His opening bit failed, people talked over him, and old fears resurfaced, fears of not being funny without Kramer, of being forgotten, of being exposed. At 11:07 p.m., two black audience members heckled him. Richards snapped. He shouted for them to be thrown out, and within seconds used the N-word. The room fell silent. Phones went up. In the minutes that followed, he delivered a furious tirade, including a disturbing reference to lynching. When hecklers mocked his failed sitcom, he erupted again, repeating the slurs several more times. His anger overwhelmed him. The meltdown lasted 2 minutes and 12 seconds before he stormed off stage. By the next day, the video had gone viral. The Laugh Factory banned him for life. 3 days later, he apologized via satellite on The Late Show with David Letterman. The apology fell flat, partly because the audience laughed nervously and partly because Richards seemed confused, defensive, and emotionally overwhelmed. Few believed his explanation that he was experimenting with performance technique. From that point on, his career essentially ended. Over nearly 2 decades, he took only minor roles, including brief appearances on Curb Your Enthusiasm in 2009 and Rick and Morty in 2017. His financial stability came from Seinfeld syndication, which reportedly still pays him around $300,000 a month. In his 2024 memoir Entrances and Exits, Richards discussed the incident and the trauma behind it. He described a life shaped by insecurity, isolation, and unresolved anger. He wrote that the meltdown broke him, but also forced him into a long period of self-reflection that eventually strengthened his relationship with his son. As of 2025, at age 76, Richards lives quietly in Los Angeles with Beth Skip. He paints, stays out of the spotlight, and speaks about the Kramer years only when asked. His story has become a cautionary tale. A moment of uncontrolled anger can collapse a career, but slow healing is possible when someone confronts the truth about themselves.